it's directed at is socially based.
Well,
Maybe some people just have this feeling that they need to hate something. So then society tells them, well, if you need to hate something, you might as well just hate this. And then it's
so
hate this race.
I never got to tell you the way in which Nietzsche picks up the theme of Ate. And that was really fun to associate to. Nietzsche has a theme called ressentiment. I might have mentioned it. Do you remember if I did or not?
Yeah.
I
It
did.
does sound familiar.
It's it's resentment with an extra S, which is a French term for resentment. And Nietzsche goes to the French because it has so many more connotations than whatever. I don't think there's a word like it in German.
I've heard a professor call it something like it's a bitterness that you hold, like you want to get back at someone, but you just hold it.
Eat
That's
your
it.
heart out. That's the most perfect translation. So what it means for Nietzsche is to internalize your aggression and to take it out on yourself. And then you
Isn't
can
that just
imagine what
aggression?
kind of stuff that leads to.
It reminds me of like the Judaism.
So eat your heart out is such a wonderful way to translate ate as it's internalized. And it goes back to the moment when Achilles has to put his sword up because Athena has intervened and gone, don't kill Agamemnon. He's the king. And so this rage then comes on Achilles like a black liquid that comes up and consumes him. And so Nietzsche says, this internalized aggression, when you can't act it out, you've got to thwart and suppress this impulse. That's Judaic Christian morals. That's turning the other cheek. Sissy shit. And Nietzsche just despises that. I mean, it's funny that it would go back to Achilles, except for the fact that Achilles wants to act on it. It's just that he's intercepted by Athena. And Nietzsche admires the Homeric heroes because they act on their impulse. And they don't suffer this delay, except for in treaties when you get their knees and you can, try to ransom yourself off. Yeah.
But isn't that just not fully thinking through the consequences of your impulses? If you just act on every impulse you have.
Sure. Exactly. So that's the
I mean,
Homeric.
what does Nietzsche say about that? Does he talk about the
Nah,
consequences?
he liked the impulsive part of it.
That's it.
Yeah, because otherwise, you're in the Hamlet dilemma. Then you can soliloquize forever about should I or shouldn't I. And he thought that just meant that you were robbed of your vitality and your ability to react. So the will to power for him is the will to self-affirmation. That's how you affirm yourself, is to act aggressively and not to harbor insults and injuries by internalizing them when you got to eat your heart out as a consequence. So it's a real interesting take on what it means to internalize aggression. Look at Gandhi. I mean, he expresses this perfectly. Satyagraha, which was the name of his movement, which means truth force, meant to be the willingness to accept the penalty for non-compliance with evil. The willingness to accept the penalty for non-compliance with evil. Now, that's a really good example of turning the other cheek and not reacting. That's nonviolence. And look at what that led to as far as his formulating that as a principle. It revolutionized India. You could almost say it was only because of that he could overthrow the British yoke, which certainly wasn't as a matter of taking up arms against the British. They couldn't win that game. So he formulates that principle. It comes over to civil rights with Martin Luther King, and look at the history it's had as far as its effect in this country on that. So anyhow, that's not the Nietzschean way. So anyhow, think of the downward stroke of Ate as this impulse to self-destruction. That's such a powerful image and concept. I never got over it. I love talking to teenagers, like my granddaughters and grandson, about the infant impulse and how much you're at the mercy of that when you're in your teens, because your prefrontal lobes haven't developed, which is apparently the neurological or brain basis for making moral judgments. So, and I remember my own difficulty with the imp and impulse. I probably had a greater measure of that than anybody. You drive a car 100 miles an hour on a busy street and you think that's really lots of fun. And you do these unbelievably ridiculous things without understanding the consequences because you're impulsive. You act it out. There's hardly any check.
Isn't that how the Republic opens? All the guys sitting around talking about how isn't it great that we aren't driven by lust anymore and we don't want to have sex? And it's
Oh, that's
great
the
because
most
we're stuck
beautiful.
around.
I want you guys to start reading the Republic because we'll pick that up, as the major text for Plato. And it's the major text for Western thought. I mean, I don't think anything supersedes the Republic of Plato as far as, being high on the list. And the Republic begins with Socrates talking to Cephalus, this old man, who says, Socrates, I really am kind of happy to be old because I'm not any longer under the sway of lustful impulses. All that kind of raging fire is now abated. And I can enjoy a kind of serene old age. I mean, the way it's stated, I mean, this kind of little bit of soliloquy by this old guy is a beautiful Platonic literary touch.
I also remember a professor telling me where in the Republic they're talking about how dogs are the greatest because they hate what's not familiar and they don't beat down the weak. Wasn't they were talking about, am I getting way out of line here?
Well, there's this episode
Where
with,
he brings 2 minute.
there's an episode with Thrasymachus, who comes kind of bawling into the discussion. And he's this absolute epitome of will to power and aggression. And they're talking about justice. And he wants to know what the hell is to talk about. I mean, you guys are confused about it? Justice means what I take it to mean, and it's the right of the mighty, and I'm the mighty, and so justice is what I say it is. And if you don't like it, I'll come and wring your neck. Yeah? To prove my point. And I'll go, So that's one definition of justice, and then fortunately he leaves. And they go on to continue the discussion. So you have that definition, the right of the mighty. That's what rules. Yeah.
Wouldn't you say the fact that nobody stands up to him though means that he's just right?
Yeah, unless you want to get your ass kicked. It's like, let him, keep quiet and he'll go away. I don't know. Yeah, I can't remember how that goes, in fact, in the sense of how Socrates responds to him. But it's a great dramatic touch. And in fact, they think that first chapter of the Republic was at first a dialogue unto itself. Because it's such a kind of self-enclosed piece, and then Plato continued writing through to the rest of it.
Don't I remember decades ago reading the Socratic dialogues a bit and Plato's Republic, but there's a consideration, Paul, for equity, balance, fairness.
Sure.
Whatever the equivalent Greek
Yeah.
terms might have been.
Yeah.
Isn't that where he concludes that a consideration of what is justice and our interactions with others, and the relationship of the government to the governed requires a respect for fairness, for equity?
That's distributive justice.
That's right.
Giving to everyone their due. So that's one of the major definitions of justice, and the provost can give us some more.
And it's referenced in the Roman Republic, both in the statutes and elsewhere, and it's referenced in that portion of the Roman law that becomes the English common law.
Yeah. I don't know if you can just take it back to the golden rule, do unto others as you have. That's a kind of quid pro quo equity issue. And that, you could say that's the heart of ethics. And Kant formulated it as the categorical imperative, namely always treat other people as persons in their own right and ends in themselves and not as means to your end. You don't manipulate them according to your desires and so on. You treat them as person. That's the categorical imperative. So that's a fairness principle as far as acknowledging the integrity and decency and so on of the other. Yeah.
But it seems like justice is unnatural because it doesn't occur anywhere but from humans. We've created this justice system, but it's most certainly unnatural, and so is rationality and all these things that we have. And science is also unnatural. Do we just constantly try to separate ourselves from nature and our mother nature by creating these systems of justice and equality for all and thinking about being and having science? Is us all just us trying to alienate ourselves from our mother?
Faye?
Thank you. That's not true. Actually, there have been some studies showing that other mammals care about justice. So I'm going to get the details wrong, but here's a general study that was done by a guy named DeWall. They gave chimpanzees, now it might have been chimpanzees or orangutans, I'm not remembering exactly, a reward of like a little raisin when they had done a good behavior. And everything was going along fine. But what chimpanzees really love are banana chips. They love them much more than raisins. And then, for one of the chimpanzees, within view of the other chimpanzees, when that one started doing the right behavior, that one got banana chips. And the others could see him getting banana chips. And then they took their raisins and threw them down. So there is a sense where animals, now I'm getting all my details wrong except the idea of this study where comparatively this animal was doing fine until another animal doing exactly the same behavior got a better reward. And then that animal was visibly, or that set of animals was visibly upset and wouldn't work for the reward that they were going through. Our only inference there is that they cared about a kind of a distributive justice, that they wanted to get the same good reward for the same behavior that the other guy got. So
the big theme in ethnobotany, which we mentioned here, but you're not making the association, is reciprocal altruism. And I mentioned a guy that is the famous proponent of that, taught here, Robert Trivers, in the earlier years. And he's now at Rutgers, and he developed this theme at Harvard under E.O. Wilson, who founded the field of ethnobotany, ethnobiology. And it's
Evolutionary biology.
yeah, and prior to them, in the school at Harvard under Wilson, you had the development of specific rituals among animals, which is a kind of justice, where a wolf will get another wolf in a deadlock and about to kill the wolf, and the wolf will expose its jugular as a specific ritual, and the aggressor wolf will back off. Does that sound like justice to you guys? There's some kind of, there's something going on there. And then that got elaborated with this reciprocal altruism, because they're all Darwinians, and so they take it into the Darwinian issue, because they're kind of a little bit confused about what's the genetic payback for being kind and considerate in the animal realm, which is to say, just.
What we've been talking about with animals and justice was making me think about dolphins. And when you have, I remember hearing stories, I couldn't say a specific story, but I remember hearing stories of what you have is human beings fall into the ocean, and you have dolphins herding them out of the ocean if there's a shark or something coming. And why do they do that? Do they get any benefit from that other than the sense of justice that the human being doesn't get eaten by the shark?
Yeah.
And it made me think about all the animals that we've talked about so far are animals that have, what we'd say compared to most animals, higher brain functions. Chimpanzees, dolphins, wolves, those are probably three of the smartest animals any of us could name.
Yeah.
So I think, I don't know, at some point, maybe it just seems that justice is just a property of having a higher functioning brain. I mean, I guess you could say it that way, but that, you know, then that boils it down to, but you know, again, we don't even really know how the brain functions to come, you know, we have this sense of like electrons or what do you call them, neurons and whatever, you know, electron pulses and whatever in our brain, but we don't really have a full understanding, I guess, of
You
what
will
that
after you read Pledge Republic. No kidding. I mean, I challenge you to just
Mhm.
take that on because they try the best they can to think it through. Yeah, and you could almost say for all time and for everybody. I mean, it's a kind of universal discussion that goes on there. There's something absolute about what they take on to try to think through. And it's all thanks to Socrates, who leads the way. Yeah.
Oh, I don't have a question.
Huh?
I don't have a question.
Okay. So, here we are. We started last time with Thales and Xenophanes, which pitches us into the introduction to philosophy. I might as well say it now. Philosophy is rational self-consciousness. So, if you want to know what the term means, you look at the history of philosophy. And we're starting with the first guys that kind of, utter something like water. And they're after the first principle, the arche. Okay, now we've gone from the archaic period and the archaic smile to the arche, A-R-C-H-E, namely the first principle, as in archaeology. Only now we're talking about the archaeology of the mind, as far as the original utterance. And so the early philosophers, the pre-Socratic philosophers, are all after the arche. What is the basic stuff? We want to finally get to it. It's almost as if they're tired of mythology. They're tired of the gods. They want to know conceptually what it is. And that's the beginning of philosophy. And that's the transition from myth to logic, and from poetry to philosophy, and from imagination to rationality.
Isn't the behavior of the marijuana plant a good enough simulation of rational self-consciousness? Where it has modified itself over thousands of years to be cultivated by humans and thus increase its range and variety and, the Michael Pollan argument.
Yeah, or, the other guy who was really clever about it, the friend of Ralph Abraham, Dennis
McKenna.
Terence McKenna.
Terence McKenna.
Dennis was his brother. Terence was kind of the successor to Leary, who argued that psychoactive plants were causative for rational self-consciousness.
Hey, he's not dead yet.
Huh?
McKenna's not dead yet.
Yeah, he is.
No.
Terence died about 15 years ago.
No, really?
Yeah.
His videos are all over YouTube.
Yeah. So if you want to get a guy that has a real interesting theme about that, that all came in about in the 60s, around Leary. There was a famous banker named Wasson who wrote a book called Soma to argue that the prevalence of the psychedelic mushroom internationally, universally, was a real factor in the breakthrough that could be called rational self-consciousness. I mean, it was a leap in being, a higher order act. And you can trace the use of psychoactive substances as a factor in that. I always kind of had my doubts about expanding the whole psychedelic thing to that kind of global proposition, but there's literature on it, and it's an interesting literature, and Terence was one of the foremost guys to really take that seriously. I mean, how do you account for the fact that this leap in being, this qualitative jump that we attribute to the Greeks, took place? And then it spills out our theme, which I tried to do a little bit to keep from being so Greek-oriented, in the axial age of Karl Jaspers and There, of course, are other traditions of rational self-consciousness, if you want to call it that, or ascended masters, or wisdom literature in other cultures and other areas. And this is one way to try to argue that. So, I made out a grid. I love doing this. I mean, I lie in bed at night because I can't sleep because I think about sitting here and talking to you guys. And it's actually a pleasure to just have like 5 or 6 hours where I lecture to you, and I really enjoy listening to myself. And one of the things I like to do is make this grid. So just get it. Here, I just wrote one down today for the fun of it, to have it available for you. So it goes from image to concept. You get the difference? You know, between a figure of speech and a conceptual, or a concept. From simile to definition. Or you could say from configuration to definition. Because last time we took pains to show how a simile is a configuration. It's a concatenation of imagery that it adheres because of this tertium comparationis, the third thing that makes comparison possible. So you have a configurational notion with similes that goes to definition. It, in a way, breaks down the gestalt, the Stimmung, the assemblage of the simile that gives expression to what otherwise can't be said. And that all gets kind of resolved in a definition. So you go from connotation to denotation. You want to kind of get over this multiple meanings in order to pin it down. So I always enjoyed the notion that there are two ways of thinking about thinking. One is configurational and one is definitional. And one is pictorial and the other is conceptual. And that's the kind of transition that we're going to in this course, from poetry to philosophy. And that's known as a classic quarrel. There are other quarrels in the history of thought that are fun to know about. There was a big quarrel between the ancients and the moderns that was precipitated by